as passive and just the recipient of decisions without their own ideas. Let us strengthen this right so that we really listen to children, that this is concrete and a part of our children's lives. Let's give a voice to our children and let us respect them. Let us speak to them politely and let us all speak to them at their level and look them in the eyes. Thank you.
Al-Sahlani for 1 minute, please.
In 4 of the EU's member states, it is still legal to hit your child. Children with a disability are still living in inaccessible societies, excluding them from school, sport, just a normal, interesting free time. And still we have member states that do not allow for children to access and inherit their parents' citizenship because the parents belong to the same sex. So the new Commission will have a lot to do when it comes to the issue of children's rights. We are not done, even if we have for 35 years been talking about children's rights and the conventions of the rights of the child. But we cannot talk about the Convention about the rights of the child without also addressing the situation in Gaza and the horrendous amounts of children who have been killed. It is time to discharge the association agreement with Israel, to adhere to the ICC decision of the arrest warrant, and it is time to actually treat all children equally. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Maza Ibanez for 1 minute.
Gracias, President.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Here today in the European Parliament, we are marking Children's Day. While we're here, more than 6,000 children are in Europe, in the Canary Islands, who've been completely abandoned by the European institutions. 98% of those children and girls have suffered sexual violence. These children are fleeing war and they are seeking shelter in Europe and they feel abandoned. Those on the far right are criminalizing and singling these people out, and they are expressing their hate towards them. And we were asked before from the PP what we can do to help children's rights. Well, what we need to do is we need to comply with Articles 22 and 39 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then also help children who are fleeing Ukraine, Africa, and the Middle East, and where children's rights are being violated most is in Palestine, where this genocide needs to be stopped once and for all. We need to comply with children's rights, and this means focusing on them. Thank you.
Rivera for 1 minute, please.
35 years following on from the adoption of the Convention on Children's Rights, many of these rights remain theoretical. Children killed by Israel in the Gaza Strip are the most cruel and inhumane proof of this reality. There is a great deal of work to be done to ensure that these rights become a reality in children's lives. We need to eradicate poverty of parents so that it doesn't affect children. We need to guarantee decent jobs with decent wages, the right to parental leave, and we need to strengthen social subsidies for families. We need to increase provision of healthcare and social services and public quality services, and we need greater offering of preschool places. We need to ensure that everyone has access to transport and healthy food. We need to combat the discrimination and violence that children fall victims to, and we need to guarantee the right to free time and to receive care within the family. We need to empower children and give them the right to participate in the decisions which affect them. It is a long path, but it is a necessary one. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Bellamy for 1.5 minutes, please.
Colleagues, Europe is currently the theater of a silent disaster, and we will see the products in the future. In Europe, 35% of children under 12 have been exposed to porno, 80% for those under 17. And psychologists have said, and they even did it here in a conference that we organized at the European Parliament, these images, this content, that leaves an undeniable mark on these children. And in the European Union, we want to protect children. And yet platforms have business on the destruction of their emotional lives. And they hide behind European law to continue their criminal activity. Now, we say this loudly and clearly, this must end. And that is why I proposed in the text on the protecting children against sexual abuse that we would have porno included as one of those abuses and make sure that these platforms have a role. We have to lock this down, and it should be considered the crime that it is. Colleagues, we must make progress on this subject so that European law is not a loophole for those who are hiding behind the fact that they're actually throwing off kilter the balance, the emotional life of children. We must justify this to all our children, and our duty should be to defend the spirit of our children. It is a role that we have to play for future generations. Thank you.
Quaestor Angel, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, President. Today we celebrate the first international instrument to recognize children as human beings entitled to fundamental freedoms and human rights. And 35 years later, we must continue strengthening these children's rights here in Europe. And therefore, comprehensive and age-adapted sexuality and relationship education is an essential tool to prevent sexual abuse, pedophilia and violence, and it is critical for the health of children and young people. In a world where sexual abuse, gender-based violence, unwanted pregnancies, AIDS and STDs pose a risk to the well-being of young people, education becomes a very powerful instrument. However, despite the clear evidence of the benefits of sexuality education, it is still challenged. Dear colleagues, the health and well-being of children cannot be politicized. It is not about ideology, it's about human rights. And together we need to fight for a more resilient society without leaving behind vulnerable groups like children living with disabilities, LGBTI young people, rainbow families, refugee and migrant children. Children are our future, but let's not forget they are also our present. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next speaker is Ms. Andriette for 1 minute, please.
Chers collègues, nous n'avons plus le temps. Non, nous n'avons plus le temps.
Colleagues, we have no time to lose to protect children in the European Union. About 250,000 disappear every year, and that is facilitated by the migration crisis. Europol flagged up about 10,000 unaccompanied children who were instrumentalized by smugglers and traffickers. And this is something that you don't seem to see. In France, 45,000 were registered in 2021, and we know that Europe is an area of passage, but it's essentially a market for victims. And then we have child pornography. So many pages that were flagged up last year. Social networks are using the dark net to spread this. We have to focus on that. We need stringent laws, international cooperation that is bolstered. As a mayor and a member, I call on us, all of us, to rally to protect children, to end this cycle of violence and uphold their fundamental rights. Whether or not we are parents, we are all responsible for children in Europe.
Speaker is Mr. Taczynski for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear leftists, we are having this very important debate on children's rights, and I'd like to know if you are aware of the greatest threat to our children now. You are. Your sick leftist ideology, gender transition, so-called sex identification. You are the threat. When I was a kid, I thought that I'm a pirate. Thank God my parents did not let me cut off my arm or poke out my eye. What you're doing, what your promotion and your ideology does to the children is let's cut off your genitals. Now we're going to pretend that you're a girl. That is why I'm going to fight your sick leftist ideology. I'm going to fight for the right of our children. I'm going to defeat you, and I'm going to make sure that your sick leftist ideology is gone forever. So help me God.
Next speaker is Ms. Foncion for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Previously in our national parliament in Ireland, I had the honour of chairing our Children's Committee for around 4 years, so I know how important the issue of children's rights are, and children must be at the heart of EU policy. We need to tackle serious issues such as child poverty, child sexual abuse and the protection of children online. While I commend the vital work of the Intergroup, the EU must do a lot more. We need a dedicated forum to amplify children's voices, and I would argue a dedicated committee to children. We also need to ensure that children's rights are actually fully realised and they do not become endless reports gathering dust on shelves. We need to ensure that action is taken. I also want to reference the situation in Palestine, because we cannot speak about children without speaking about the horrific situation that they find themselves in. How can the EU seriously claim to champion children's rights while refusing to suspend the association agreement with Israel? How can we talk about children's rights when Israeli bombs rain down on Gaza and children burn alive in tents? Every single child matters, no matter where they are born or where they come from, and every single child deserves the same rights, protections and opportunities.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Lopatka for 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to start positive. I want to mention that the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child is a convention with a strong support by the member countries of the United Nations. 196 countries are party to it, including every member state except the United States. This is a record number, but there is a big but. But we have to see that the adoption of this important convention doesn't mean that all the rights are really fulfilled. It reminds us to our collective responsibility to advocate for and uphold the rights of every child across Europe and around the globe. Every child has the right to education, also all girls in Afghanistan. As European parliamentary members, we must make decisive actions to take inspiration and enhance our own projects in our member states, and we have to use our development projects to support the needs of children, especially in countries where living standards are very, very low. We must recognize the importance of EU initiatives such as the European Child Guarantee. Let us move forward with determination to fulfill our obligations to the children. Together, we have to work for a future where every child's rights are respected.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ms. Insia for 1 minute, please.
In all actions involving children, the best interest of the child shall be primary consideration, is stated in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Despite this, children continue to face significant challenges and government responses are lacking. Eurostate's stat reported that in 2023, 24.8% of the children in EU were at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Additionally, there was 1.3 million reports of child sexual abuse in the EU that year, and many children are being recruited into organized crime. How a society treats its most vulnerable is a measure of its humanity. While all member states have ratified the convention, we must move from words to actions. We need to implement an EU-wide strategy to prevent child recruitment into organized crime, hold social media platforms accountable to ensure we protect children from online sexual abuse and recruitment, ensure that all member states provides housing, education, healthcare and basic needs for all children so that achieving one's dreams is not dependent on parental welfare. And finally, I want to say to the far right here, there is one sick ideology in here, and that is your ideology that is depriving so many children their right to be themselves.
Thank you. Ms. Insia, your time is over. You have
that
to
even
stop
leads
now.
to.
So, sorry. Sorry, your time is over. Next speaker is Ms. Rechondieu for 1 minute, please.
Éducateurs qui ont des...
Teachers that have sexual relations with kids, dropouts, running away, drugs, explosion in the number of prostitutes. What we see in France is disastrous. Children should be one of the priorities of the state, but it is not. These children have been forgotten, and yet the budget for children keeps going up. One of the reasons for this is that apparently we're focusing on these irregular migrants that are flooding villages in France. And then if we look at the ECJ rulings, there has been an aberration and delinquencies on the rise. To protect our social system, we need to establish border checks at our borders.
Next speaker is Mr. Bartulica for 1 minute, please.
Zahvaljujem, kolegice I kolege.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We have heard a lot about the rights of the child this morning, but none of these rights will be guaranteed unless they have the right to be born. So there is a lot of hypocrisy in this House, and we have to say that children are not protected 35 years after the adoption of this convention. In addition to the right that, in addition to the fact that they don't have the right to be born, we should talk about the rights of unborn children. Children are being indoctrinated and brainwashed at schools from the earliest age. This should stop, as well as the sexualization of young children. I think we have heard enough of this hypocrisy. We have to say loud and clear that some animals enjoy better protection in Europe than unborn children.
Lavak for 1 minute, please. Oh, sorry, the next speaker is Mr. Furore for 1 minute, please. Sorry, that was my mistake.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, President. In Europe, 1 in 4 children lives in poverty. And then there are children that the parents of which are not recognized. For example, the rainbow families, children that are born in Europe and that are not European citizens. Today, we are commemorating the 35th anniversary of the adoption of the convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We shouldn't just use this as a commemoration. We should use it to fight any type of violence, whether it be physical, psychological, or digital, through laws that fight poverty or social exclusion and more integration. That is why the Five Star Movement proposes the Jus Scolae, which is a law that would integrate foreign minors through citizenship. Now, I'd like to turn to this parliament and criticize. You voted for austerity that cuts funds for daycare centers and for minors' rights. How much hypocrisies can you have?
For 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Vice President, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues. When this convention was adopted, some of you here present were children or were not born, and nobody thought that 35 years later we would be facing the same issues. It is really shocking that 1 in 5 children in the EU are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. 1 in 2 children in Ukraine had to leave their home due to war, and 700,000 children were forcefully moved to Russia or to Russian-controlled territories. These are facts that we have to deal with. Contemporary challenges require politicians to give certain answers. The rise of depression among young people indicates that we need better support for mental health. And I would also like to dedicate myself to working for a regulation on a safer digital environment and criminalizing cyberbullying. We are the ones who must be responsible for the future of our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ms. Keulemans for 1 minute, please.
Merci, Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. 35 years ago, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was the first international instrument that recognized children as individuals who are innate rights holders. However, today in Europe, 1 in 4 children lives with poverty or social exclusion, and the mental health problems of young people are more concerning than ever before. 3 years ago, we adopted a European Child Guarantee, which included effective access to rights such as free structures to welcome them, free schooling, and 1 school meal a day, free, but also access to free healthcare, healthy food, and appropriate housing. The commitments are clear, but the road to get there still seems very long. That's not acceptable in a society such as ours. Our new youth commissioner will have a lot of work ahead of them, but they can count on us because each child counts and has the right to live out its childhood happily and to build a future equally far from the sexist and racist ideologies that we've heard examples from today from the far right.
Is Mr. Everding for 1 minute, please.
Happy birthday, liebe Kinderrechte.
Happy birthday, Convention on the Rights of the Child. According to recent surveys, the majority of children and young people are familiar with the term children's rights, but they don't exactly know what it means, and this is why we need much more awareness raising in schools. In my opinion, children have the right to healthy food, which is not the result of animal suffering, and the right to clean and intact environment. And in this context, the right to participation is important, and the Education for Sustainable Development is a key tool. But in the 2025 German federal budget, drastic cuts are planned, and I say no cuts at the expense of children. And there's another important aspect is mental health for children. This has got worse continuously since the 2010s. This can lead to anxiety, depression, and even suicide at a young age. But the majority of young people in Europe have no access to treatment and remain untreated. This is unacceptable. Finally, it's important to mention that more than 1,500 children have died or gone missing when fleeing the Mediterranean. Thank you.
Eine blaue Karte.
There is a blue card for you von Siegbert Dröse. Will you accept that blue card?
Sie müssen es akzeptieren zuerst.
Ja,
You have to accept it first of all.
Mr. Drose. 362.
Herr Kollege, ich habe jetzt Ihren
Colleague, I listened very closely to what you said, and you say that you're representing the left of this House and that you really want to focus on the future of children. But my question, the SED in the GDR was your predecessor, and this was known for forced adoptions on a mass scale. With that, how do you deal with the history of that? How will you look at that on the left side?
Lieber Kollege, das wollte ich gerade.
Well, colleague, I just wanted to point out, even when I belong to the left group here, I'm part of the Animal Protection Party in Germany. There's no SED past there, so perhaps you should address that question to Die Linke, not me.
Mulțumesc. Aș ruga cumva colegii din același partid.
Thank you. I would like to kindly ask colleagues from the same parties or political groups to not ask each other questions so that they can speak for longer. Mrs. Ripa has the floor.
Kinder in Europa und
Children in Europe and worldwide are too affected by mental health and less access to education, for example. We haven't seen enough progress. 20 million children in the EU grow up in poverty, and the mental burden and the anxiety and depression, these are all going up significantly in Europe because of pressure and the constant presence of digital media. For example, in Belgium, suicide is the most common cause of death for children and young people. Children need space to relax and to be supported. Children expect a proper future to be offered to them, and therefore for that we need a healthy planet. We need to bolster children's rights, and when taking political decisions they need to be considered more, and we need to have an impact assessment for children's rights when developing policy, focus on preventative measures and focus and invest in more care. Our children deserve that, and the future demands that of us. Thank you.
Ich muss mich bei den zwei Herren...
Sorry, I have to apologise, Mr. Dröser and the other colleague. I was a little bit wrong there. Thank you.
Mr. Alexandru Zan has the floor.
Thank you, President. On the 35th anniversary of the UN Convention on the Rights of Child, we know this document is all the more important because it makes no distinction on gender, sexual orientation, creed, race. But what we've noticed is that the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, young people, specifically LGBTQ+ children, are frequently subjected to discrimination and conversion policy. This is terrible violence. It means that a lot of teenagers are forced to suicide. So I'd like to ask our members from the right that continue to use this rhetoric, we do not touch children. What do you think about the adults that have responsibility over their children and that are forcing these kids into this conversion policy? It's horrible. We know that the Commission is poised to ban this policy, and I'd like to call on the Commission to come up with a legislative proposal to put an end to conversion policy throughout the entire EU. This is a fundamental instrument to protect the well-being of minors. Thank you.
Mr. Zan, there is a blue card from Vicek Anna Maria. Will you accept it?
Thank you. I would like to ask you, since you have been talking about LGBTQI plus children, do you know that psychologically speaking, we cannot talk about LGBTQI children because there is